Chapter 10, The Eye, Part 2. Twilight took some small solace in the relaxing ticks and hums of the ship as she and Fluttershy paced through the halls. Surprisingly enough, knowledge of the Everfree Forest seemed to have lapsed altogether since their own time. Seasaber had listened carefully to the description she and her friends gave of the dark forest, and then declared they weren't ready for any dive at all, let alone one into the most dangerous land in old Equestria. Stocks still needed replenishing, the submarine's interior still needed a few repairs, and then there was the issue of the lack of dive suits. They had made orders for custom suits to be delivered to the rich estate, but those wouldn't be due for another 2 weeks at least, and Twilight was unwilling to make random flights around the sky to evade their new hunter while they waited. With Highton no longer safe, Seasaber and Sunfeather had put their heads together and presented Twilight with a brief detour. The city of Leviathan Wakes was passing nearby on its way to the High Frog Islands, and would serve more than capable of preparing the ship and crew for a dangerous dive. Twilight had asked what exactly was meant about a city passing by, only for Star Trails to butt in and exclaim, with an infuriating smirk, that it was a surprise. Irritably enough, the rest of the crew seemed to have agreed with her, and so Twilight was left hanging on the matter. She could only assume that, as flying islands, the cities of this new Equestria were capable of some limited movement. She hadn't seen any such indications so far with Highton, but maybe she just hadn't been paying enough attention. They had to be nearly there now. Twilight had taken an opportunity to join Star Trails in reviewing the ship's charts, and they were certain to arrive before sunset with at least an hour to spare. She'd kept her eyes on the horizon all day. Whether she was searching for floating islands or Griffin airships, she wasn't sure, but it had remained empty. It was just passing midday now, though, so it couldn't be long. A sudden metallic clank startled her out of her thoughts. She looked around to find herself standing next to one of the hatches that led out to the submarine harness, with Fluttershy pushed up against her side and shaking like a leaf. A few smaller bangs rang out in quick succession as the hatch's wheels spun and unlocked, and it swung open to admit a giddy Rainbow Dash.
Twilight! Fluttershy! Guess what?
She had to shout to be heard over the sound of the wind rushing past the door.
I just saw Leviathan Wakes! You guys are gonna flip when you see it, trust me! It's way radicaler than Highton!
A brief battle played out in Twilight's mind, and grammatical accuracy won out over adventurous curiosity.
That's not a word!
She shouted back. Her horn lit up as she shut the hatch and spun the lock.
Yeah, whatever.
Rainbow Dash waved a hoof like she was swatting an irritating, grammatically correct fly out of the air.
Hey, do either of you... Whoa. Twilight, you alright?
Twilight flicked her tail, looking up at Rainbow defiantly. She hadn't got much sleep last night, and had been hoping No Punny would notice.
I'm fine. Were you going to ask me something?
Rainbow cocked her head, watching Twilight with narrowed eyes for a few seconds.
Well, if you say so. Do either of you know where Applejack is?
Fluttershy glanced up from the floor for a brief instant. Twilight raised a hoof to tap at her chin for a few moments.
She should be with Dusty Tome. He wanted to know about life in the old Equestrian. Well, you know how she can be with her stories.
Rainbow snickered into a huff.
Sure as hey I do. I'm gonna go get her and give her the good news. Meet us at the bridge.
She zipped off with a flap of her wings, tossing the other mare's manes with the ensuing gust of wind. Twilight watched her go, and only as the Pegasus turned the corner did she realize that she still had no idea what Leviathan Wakes looked like.
Hey, wait, Rainbow! Oh.
She groaned, slapping herself in the head.
Stupid. Get your head in gear, Twilight.
With a sigh, she forced a smile and looked over to where Fluttershy had taken cover from her outburst behind a nearby bulkhead.
Shall we head to the bridge then?
Fluttershy let out a shrill little squeal that could have just as easily been a mouse's distress call as it could have been words. Twilight's smile grew hollow, and she faced ahead to hide her tired eyes.
Right, let's go.
she said with all the optimism she could muster. She led the way down the hall, confident that Fluttershy would follow. The quiet mare had stuck to her friends like a duckling to its mother ever since leaving the rich estate, communicating only in mumbles, squeaks, and shakes of the head. Twilight was starting to wonder if maybe there was something wrong with her besides just her usual shyness. Had she been plagued by the same nightmares as Twilight before the hibernation spell was broken? She'd seemed so peaceful, and yet...
Then again, it's not an entirely unusual reaction for her, after waking up centuries past the end of the world.
Twilight gave herself a mental shake as they climbed the stairs to the ship's higher level.
Oh, come on, Twilight! Where's your scientific wonder? Rainbow seemed excited about the city. Let's see what the big surprise is.
By the time the two mares had reached the closed door to the bridge, Twilight had successfully mustered her excitement and anticipation. She stepped through the steamy haze of the opening door without flinching and nearly walked right into Flintlock. The big stallion raised a brow as he looked down at them. Well, that was quicker than I expected. You wanted on the bridge, little mares.
Thank you,
Twilight said. She slipped past him, Fluttershy following close behind, and looked eagerly to the viewing glass.
I heard we were almost there.
Star Trails looked up from where she was sitting next to the charts.
What? Where'd you hear that? I told her,
Rainbow said, briefly folding her wings to fit through the cluttered doorway.
I was flying ahead and saw it.
Flint yelped in alarm at the sudden rainbow blur, ducking down. His nostrils flared as Applejack trotted up the hall. Why did I even bother going to get you lot? He growled.
Howdy there, Flint,
Applejack said. She chuckled.
You don't mind if I get through?
Flint rolled his eyes, stepping out of the way. Be my guest, Cowfilly. Twilight had, by then, pushed past the traffic jam and was already standing up on the tips of her hooves next to Sunfeather's control dais.
Where is it? I don't see it anywhere.
Trails groaned in frustration, leering at the hovering Rainbow Dash.
Why'd you have to go and get her? I had the timing down perfect and you screwed it up. Minutes of planning. Down the drain.
Rainbow snorted.
Keep your horn on, Trails. I didn't spoil the surprise or anything.
The room settled into a comfortable buzz as the newly arrived ponies spread out along the back to wait for their destination's appearance. Twilight ignored the quiet conversation, keeping her eyes trained ahead. After a few minutes, she risked a glance towards Sunfeather.
How much longer?
Sunfeather didn't bother to look away from her controls.
We're just about 10 miles away.
After another minute, she added,
I think you'll like this city. Really?
Twilight cocked her head, surprised to hear the surly pilot make conversation for the first time.
Why? You'll see soon enough. Oh, okay.
Twilight returned her gaze forwards, feeling somewhat like an awkward filly pestering her sitter with questions.
If it's just 10 miles away, shouldn't we be able to see it by now?
She knew the horizon kept ponies from seeing much more than 7 miles, but tall objects like mountains or, say, floating islands were visible from further away. At last, the first buildings came into view, their faces darkened by the afternoon sun behind them. Gradually, they drifted closer, rising up until their bases were visible, and then further up as the island... Twilight frowned. The buildings had stopped rising as they approached. They were getting closer, but remaining at sea level. Her eyes widened.
They're boats.
She stole a glance towards Sunfeather and saw that the old mare was actually wearing a satisfied little smirk. With a shake of her head, Twilight returned her gaze to the ocean-born city burgeoning before them. Leviathan Wakes was the very definition of urban sprawl. Hundreds of seafaring vessels were clustered together, bobbing softly on the waves with only rope, chain, and bridge to keep any piece from drifting away. And no doubt, any that did break off would be gone forever, Twilight noted, as most of them seemed to lack any means of propulsion at all. The city was more raft than boat. Even the larger, sturdier parts resembled squat buildings that had been ripped from the land and dropped into the water, the waves lapping at their long-stained ground floors. At the leading edge of it all was a single huge wooden construct, its star-shaped walls guarded by stern-faced carvings and engraved with flowing gold and silver filigree. The extravagant decoration set it apart from its neighbors just as much as its sheer size. Long flagpoles spurred out from each of the star's 6 points, each sporting a different emblem, and the roof of each limb was painted with colors matching the emblem of its flag. There were only a few other buildings of such size and solidity. The great majority of the city was little more than a complex patchwork of platforms, floating shanties, and occasionally the bare hull of a ship. Still, Twilight didn't see any means by which the city might move. Was the whole city at the mercy of the ocean currents?
And isn't the ocean home to monsters that eat ponies? How could so many live there in such a ramshackle place?
There didn't seem to be any sort of defenses set up that might drive back such an attack. She looked away with the question in her eyes, first to Sunfeather, who was keeping her gaze firmly forwards, and then to the grinning Star Trails.
Go on,
Star Trail said.
I know you want to ask.
Twilight narrowed her eyes, her ears flicking back ever so slightly. She didn't like being led on like this. It reminded her of secondary school. How many needless hoops had she willingly jumped through in her life, all to feed her thirst for knowledge? Her nostrils flared, and in her mind's eye she saw herself grabbing Trails by the horn and smashing that cheeky grin into the floor until it... Twilight blinked, her mind going blank.
What?
Applejack was watching her, lips quirked with concern. You alright, Sugar Cube?
And are you gonna ask the question?
Trails added. Sea Saber stomped a hoof from where she'd been watching in silence, the harsh ring drawing attention to her.
That's enough, Trails. She's not some rabbit you can dangle a carrot over.
She turned to speak to Twilight.
The city is pulled by a pair of ancient Leviathans. They are guided by carefully placed nets filled with fish, and the ocean's monsters refuse to get anywhere near them. Any other questions? No, thank you.
Twilight looked away quickly, keeping her eyes on the city and the short docking tower growing larger in the viewport. She did have more questions, of course, but the violent daydream was still lingering in her thoughts, like dark clouds receding past the horizon. Peering into the waters below, Twilight's eyes picked out the vague, lumbering shadows of the Leviathans.
Leviathan wakes, huh?
They were huge, majestic, and yet Twilight felt no stirring wonder in her heart. All she felt was tired, hollow, and Applejack's curious gaze boring into the back of her head. Twilight always felt better when her mind had something to occupy it, and their whirlwind layover at Leviathan Wakes was just the mercy she needed. There was much to be done, and the threat of Gava following them gave little opportunity to relax. The 3 days they stayed there were spent being fitted for dive suits, purchasing supplies, and working on the submarine in a rented workshop. That night, Twilight drew up plans, scoured history books for hints of the Everfree's current nature, and plotted potential courses with Rainbow Dash and Star Trails. She snatched sleep in short bursts of no more than 2 hours, weary of exposing herself to her nightmare again. But she was left blissfully dreamless. Through it all, she avoided any lengthy conversation with Applejack, always keeping an excuse on hoof if she needed a quick getaway. She knew that her friend was worried about her, but what could the cowpony do? Magic had always been her domain. Twilight had a task before her, and losing herself in it was a great comfort to her straining mind. After the blur that was Leviathan Wakes, they spent 2 days flying southwest. Twilight hadn't found any explicit references to an Everfree forest during her research, but it had become apparent after just a few cross-references that the forest hadn't moved anywhere. Journals, charts, and almanacs all warned of a serpent's eye, a patch of sky where airships went in and rarely came out unmolested. There were stories of ships drifting just outside of it with no sign of any pony ever being aboard, of bold salvage teams that launched expeditions into the waters beneath and never resurfaced, and wayward crews that returned to port babbling and mad. The hazy borders of the eye were right where both Twilight and Rainbow believed the Everfree forest once grew, and even Sea Saber had mentioned it once she realized where the charted course would take them. There wasn't any clear demarcation of where the eye started. Even as they neared the end of their course, Twilight wasn't sure when exactly they passed into it. The skies were just as clear, the waves just as calm, and yet there came a moment when she realized that her hooves had become restless, bearing her back and forth across the ship as she searched for imaginary hunters behind every cloud. Twilight nearly jumped out of her fur when the steady rhythm of the Argo's ticking stumbled into a ragged staccato clanking that reminded her of an old smoker drawing breath. She knew only the barest principles that the ship's complex interior relied on, but it was clear even to her that something was wrong. The ship gave a janky lurch, and then began to slowly lose altitude. A second passed, and a low alarm began to ring through the halls. It wasn't a crash or a dive, but it was definitely not the same pace that the ship normally used when descending. It took Twilight less than a minute to run down the hall, taking the stairs up 2 at a time and burst into the flight room.
What's going on?
She asked.
I felt something.
Every pony aboard the ship was already there, making the large room feel notably cramped. Envelope pressure's dropping, Flint said. He frowned at her as he leaned against the doorframe, one of his guns cradled in his hooves like a favorite child. Seems that curse makes quick work.
There's no such thing as curses,
Twilight said, stepping further into the room. It had practically become a reflex to her after the poison joke fiasco.
Enchantments, maledictions, illusions, even Gias, yes, but curses, hexes, and bewitchments are all just myths.
Sunfeather spoke up from the control dais.
Well, your myth just busted my pipes.
She grunted as she pumped both front hooves down onto a heavy pedal before her with a steady rhythm.
And what exactly is that gonna mean?
Applejack asked. She took her hat off and held it to her chest.
We ain't gonna lose the ship, are we? We'll be fine,
Saber said. The confidence in her voice was a reassuring relief from the loud bangs and scrapes coming from the hull.
The Argo was made to float if needed, whether to save energy or make repairs. Once we touch down and stabilize the engine, we can get started on replacing the pipe. How long is that gonna take?
Rainbow asked. She was hovering above the control dais, giving the approaching ocean nervous glances every few seconds.
Probably about a day,
Trails said. She shrugged.
We've had a problem with that pipe once before. It's a real cow to get to, and there's no room for more than a couple ponies to work on it at a time. Well, we aren't gonna wait around braiding our manes for a whole day, are we?
Rainbow asked.
That Gava chick could still be tailing us, and we're already close enough to use the sub, right?
Sunfeather cleared her throat.
Brace yourselves,
she said as if she was telling the time of day. Every pony rushed to grab onto something, and Twilight was quick to follow suit. The ship gave another shuddering heave just before the wide viewport before them smashed into the water. For a brief moment, Twilight feared that the ship would sink, the water sliding almost high enough to completely submerge the flight room. But then the ship's buoyancy took over, and Twilight's stomach lurched as the flight room burst out of the water, and she held tight until the ship, engine now silent, settled into the steady rocking of the waves. Saber was the first to speak.
Status report? Not showing any indications of further damage,
Sunfeather said as she scanned the walls of gauges. She flicked her tail.
But scratch that. Another pipe cracked.
Trails groaned.
Oh, fantastic.
Any luck good with oil on your hooves?
Flint asked, standing up.
Dusty's about as useful with repairs as, well, a historian. I'd hate to leave Sunfeather to do all the work on her own.
Dusty Tone looked up from where he was clinging to a railing.
Hey, I can help.
Applejack raised a hoof. I ain't seen too much of how y'all work things these days, but I reckon I was a handy hoof back in our time. I can lend a hoof if y'all'll take me.
You aren't gonna come down with us?
Rainbow asked, frowning.
We should stick together.
Applejack smiled as she stuck her hat back on her head. Don't you worry about me, none gals. You'll just go and do your part, and we'll have the ship up and running smoother in the summer festival. I'll be sure to give anything that tries us a good bucking before it knows what's hit it. It's settled then, Saber said, cutting off Rainbow's protests. Sunfeather, Dusty, and Applejack will stay to work on the ship. As for the rest of us, let's prepare to dive.
Rarity?
Yes, darling? Rarity looked up from the fabric she was cutting. Pinkie Pie was standing in the opening of her work tent, trays of banana bread stacked up high on her back.
Have you seen my special envelopes?
Pinkie asked. She stepped further into her tent, casting her gaze around the organized mayhem of textiles. Rarity frowned. Her horn shimmered as she levitated her working glasses off, folded them, and gently set them down. Your special envelopes. Be a dear and remind me what those are.
The ones that Twilight made for me. Duh!
Pinkie lifted a pile of fabulously folded blankets with a single hoof, her nose wrinkling as she sniffed at the thin grass underneath. Her tail twitched a staccato rhythm behind her.
I had her weatherproof a set before we left. You know, in case of extreme invitation emergencies.
Rarity had just been about to remark about bothering Twilight with such trivialities when the poor mare always seemed so busy of late, when she caught sight of the poofy pink tail bobbing up and down. She stole a glance up towards the top of the tent.
Pinkie, dear, have you noticed your tail? Huh?
Pinkie looked back at her tail. Her eyes shot wide open, almost as if she had forgotten it was there.
Oh, Rarity, what do you think it means if my tail twitches backwards?
Rarity frowned. She could not remember a time Pinkie was ever uncertain on the meaning of a twitching tail. Every pony knew what a twitching tail meant, after all. I'm not sure, dear. I didn't think it was precisely possible for something to twitch backwards.
Neither did I,
Pinkie said. Her lips quirked to the side as she scratched at the ground.
It's been happening for half an hour and nothing's fallen. This has never happened before.
Well, I'm sure if you give it some time, you'll figure out what it means, Rarity said, returning her gaze to her work. After a few seconds, she hesitated, peering back up. It isn't a doozy, is it? But Pinkie had already left. Rarity listened to her light-hearted humming drift into the distance, and then dismissed the matter from her mind. Twilight stood atop the gently rocking deck of the submarine as the Argo bobbed around her. The ship was slumped over at a strange angle without its engine to hold it right, casting her into the thick shadow of its hull. Rainbow Dash's voice crackled into her helmet.
Twilight, you coming in or are we having you swim along?
A tired little smile cracked Twilight's lips.
I'm heading down now,
she said. It was more awkward than she liked climbing down the ladder wearing the new dive suit, but it was necessary. Even with the modifications made to the sub for extra space, it would be a tight-fitting journey with her tube friends and Saber's team. There was no room to stow the suits until they were needed. That said, the one she wore now wasn't nearly as clumsy as the spare she had worn before. She'd even had it painted with purple highlights and outlined with violet lights.
And it's easier to hide my exhaustion behind this helmet.
She closed the hatch behind her before squeezing into the congested control room. Everyone but Flint was waiting there. Saber and Trails were needed to pilot the sub, and Rainbow just couldn't stand being anywhere but at the front of anything. Fluttershy was probably just there to be close to Rainbow. Twilight had been surprised when Fluttershy had shown up outfitted in her dive suit, quietly trailing Rainbow Dash and somehow still seeming small and frail within the bulky armor. At first, she had wondered as to why the Yellow Pegasus would ever want to dive headfirst into the apocalypse, but it had become apparent once Dusty Tom had followed her around asking for an interview. Sea Saber looked back as Twilight's heavy armored hooves clanked against the floor.
Every pony in?
A chorus of affirmatives sounded off in her helmet, ranging from Flint's baritone grunt to Fluttershy's quiet little squeak. Twilight was the last to answer.
We're ready.
Roger that. Taking us down.
Twilight watched as the water slowly lapped higher and higher on the sub's viewport, until they were completely submerged. As the depths of the ocean swallowed them in its darkness, she clicked her radio transmitter off. She didn't want her friends to hear how fast she was breathing. Rarity could feel her diplomatic smile straining as she followed Whitehorn through the Fellis Island Thaumagram station. It was a garish affair, with an excess of expensive finery and stained glass placed in such a way that, in her professional opinion, was just passing atrocious. It was not the building which had her on edge, however. No, her quarrel was with its owner, operator, and resident, Mr. Lay Drifts. Whitehorn looked back at her, a knowing smirk on his face. Careful, Lady Rarity. Your ire is showing. She scoffed, eyeing the passing tapestries with a derisive gaze.
I hardly think my attitude towards Mr. Drifts is any great secret, Whitehorn.
Perhaps not, but there's no sense in antagonizing him. Rarity sighed. She ran a hoof through her mane, straightening the most rebellious curls.
I'm sorry, but the stress of having even more ponies to care for in a couple days might just be getting to me. If that buffoon is incapable of keeping himself in check, then I cannot be blamed for biting back.
Whitehorn chuckled. Very well then, my lady. Let's see how it turns out. He opened the door leading to the room where the thaumagrams themselves were transmitted, stepping aside to allow Rarity through. She dipped her head in thanks, screwing her nose up as she walked into the hazy cloud of cigar smoke that seemed to breed and multiply between every visit. The room was dominated by a smoke-stained steel terminal set in the far wall, its surface home to at least 24 bouncing needles and gauges that gave off a constant droning hum. Heavy drapes covered the floor-to-ceiling window on the left wall, and so the only source of light was the 3-tiered chandelier hanging from above. Its light filtered through the smoke to illuminate a pair of ponies, a mare and a stallion. The Pegasus mare was clearly frazzled and overworked, her eyes darting back and forth as she scanned the snacks of paper scattered about her desk, scribbling urgently on a worn notepad. The orange-coated stallion was much more relaxed, seated in front of the terminal with his magic wrapped around the pale white control orb set before him. The mare flinched at the sound of the door opening, looking up to greet the newcomers with a lopsided smile.
Hello, welcome to the Thaumagram station. How can we help?
Whitehorn dipped his head, reaching into his saddlebags to pull out a trio of thick letters. We were wondering if Mr. Drifts would be able to send some correspondence to Highton for us. The mare's face paled at the size of the stack. She took a deep breath to speak, only to be cut off by Lay Drifts turning around. Whitehorn, and Lady Rarity, he said, the latter with a thin covering of undisguised irritation. Of course I can take care of you if you've got the bits. Highton, you say? How many words are we talking? Just a few thousand, if you would, Whitehorn said. They're drafts for my article. Rarity cleared her throat, pulling a single letter out of her purse.
And a couple hundred for myself, please.
Mr. Drifts grunted, turning back to his terminal.
85 bits, and I'll have your messages up by tomorrow morning.
Excellent, Whitehorn said. The stack of papers fell on the pale mare's table with an audible thunk, drawing a small whimper from her. Rarity's letter floated down a second later, resting daintily on top.
And here is the fee, madam,
Rarity said, levitating the proper amount of bits out of her bag and onto the table. The instant the bits left her magical grasp, they were wrapped up in the pale yellow glow of Mr. Drift's magic. They floated to his side, spinning in a rapid circle as he counted.
85 it is. It's always nice when customers don't try to gip you.
Rarity's smile twisted into a grimace. She held herself back for a full second before the words broke free.
Is that a problem you have often, Mr. Drift?
Lay Drifts chuckled, the cigar floating out of his mouth to let him speak clearly.
More than you know, Lady Rarity. I know you're new to these parts, but as one gifted to another, let me clue you in. Those damnable refugees will try just about anything to cheat a pony.
Rarity grit her teeth. It was bait, and she knew it.
A lady does not rise to... From what I've heard, you're the one that's been trying to cheat them.
Is that so? He turned around, magic still glowing around the terminal as it hummed away.
I think you've been spending too much time around those bastards, Lady Rarity, if you don't mind my saying. I don't know what lies they fill your ears with, but used to be a dozen of them coming up here every day offering me just about everything under the sun but bits.
These ponies are only trying to speak to their families,
Rarity snapped.
They offer you jewelry and food and favors because they didn't have time to grab a bag of bits when their home fell out of the sky. And you deny them any contact with the outside world. It's heartless.
Do I look like a charity to you, my lady?
Laydrift asked. His eyes widened as he leaned over, letting out a series of ragged coughs before straightening.
Whatever. You bring bits, I do my job. That's how it works. Now, unless you've got any more work for me, I'm busy.
He turned around, sticking the cigar back into his mouth and giving it a few furious chews. Rarity glared at the back of his head for a few seconds, jaw still clenched. But she knew there was no point to it. She'd already shamed herself enough by losing control. There were ponies just outside that needed her, and she wouldn't be any help to them standing around and arguing with a gifted oaf. She spun to face the open door, seeing Whitehorn leaning patiently on the frame. With a righteous whoof, she marched out into the hall, not even looking back to see if he followed.
Bravo, Lady Rarity, Whitehorn's voice said behind her.
That Laydrift doesn't deserve the mark on his flank,
Rarity said.
He could make such a difference for those poor ponies, and instead he near single-handedly cuts them off from the world.
There are still messengers and mail ships that deliver for the refugees, Whitehorn said. He might be an obstacle, but at least they can go around. Rarity came to a stop before the door leading outside, brow furrowed.
What right does he have to be this way? It's as if he thinks that Cutie Mark has a divine right to treat the world as his own worthless oyster. And you tell me that all gifted are like that?
Whitehorn shrugged, coming up beside her. Most of them, at least. But they aren't usually familiar with the struggles of their fellow pony.
It isn't proper.
Rarity opened the door a little too roughly, sending it swinging back into the wall.
The gifted could do so much good if only they tried.
She turned a step outside and nearly stepped right into Pinkie Pie.
Hi, Rarity,
she said.
I have a problem.
Rarity cocked her head, her anger slipping away.
What is it, darling?
Pinkie turned, pointing a hoof at her backwards twitching tail.
Twitchy tail! It's getting worse!
Rarity took a reflexive step back into the confines of the station, stealing a nervous glance up.
Well, that's quite alarming, dear, but I don't think that's really a big... No, you don't understand!
Pinky grabbed her, dragging her out into the noontime sunlight. She leaned in close to Rarity's ear, whispering loud enough for any pony around to hear.
I think it might be a doozy!
Rarity frowned, pulling away.
Well, do you know what kind, Pinky?
She looked to the mare's tail and saw that it was, indeed, twitching violently, and in a pattern she had never seen it make before. Whitehorn cleared his throat, following the two outside. I'm sorry, what's happening? Her tail is twitching, and that means... what exactly? Rarity turned to answer him, only for the words to die in her throat as she felt a peculiar sensation pass through her horn. It wasn't something she had exactly felt before, but it reminded her almost of the feeling of stepping outside a warm house in the middle of a clear winter morning, or of biting into a meal only to find it cold in the middle. She was suddenly aware that there had been some magic existing in the background, so faint that she hadn't even noticed it until it just now was peeled away. She frowned. Her heartbeat had sped up. There was a sudden urge to flee, and yet she knew not where to or what from.
Did you feel that, dears?
A chorus of screams echoed up from the nearest river. Rarity's heart skipped a beat as she galloped to the closest railing, looking down into the valley below to see the refugee camp had been thrown into a sudden panic. Ponies were running everywhere, stumbling desperately up the neighboring hillsides where fellow citizens were watching curiously. Through it all, one particular shriek came clearly to her ears.
No! Celestia, no, not again!
Rarity took a few slow steps, turning to her friends behind her.
Do you think we should head for...
A deep rumble shook up Rarity's hooves, and she was struck with the inexplicable sensation of falling.